Jim Walker had spent years perfecting the art of blending in. To anyone walking into his small one-chair barbershop on a quiet street in Houston, Texas, he was just a middle-aged man with calloused hands, a kind smile, and a knack for a good haircut. His faded tattoos and quiet demeanor gave no hint of his past. Few would guess that those hands had once carried the weight of a sniper rifle in the deadliest combat zones in the world. Fewer still would suspect that Jim was one of the Navy SEALs who had carried out missions that would never be declassified. But Jim preferred it that way. He wasn't looking for recognition or trouble. All he wanted was peace, a simple life, far removed from the chaos he had left behind. The barbershop was his sanctuary, a place where he could find solace in routine and the sound of scissors snipping through hair. That peace was shattered on an otherwise uneventful Thursday afternoon. The first sign of trouble was the roaring engine of a black SUV pulling up outside his shop. Jim glanced out the window, noticing the vehicle lingering longer than it should. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see who was inside. His instincts, honed over decades of survival, immediately kicked in. Something about the situation felt wrong. He watched as the doors opened and 3 men stepped out. They were young, dressed in flashy clothes, and carried an air of arrogance that Jim had seen before in his life, back in war zones where overconfident men often met quick ends. One of them flicked a cigarette to the ground and stomped it out before. Striding toward the shop, the doorbell jingled as they entered, their swagger filling the small space. Jim put down his broom and gave them a polite nod, masking the unease bubbling beneath his calm exterior. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Jim said, his voice steady. The tallest of the 3 men smirked and leaned against the counter. "Nice little place you got here, old man," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. Jim said nothing, his eyes scanning each of them, taking in the detail, the way they stood, the way their eyes darted around the shop, the faint bulge under the leader's jacket suggesting a concealed weapon. These weren't customers looking for a haircut. "You know who we are?" the leader asked, leaning in closer. Jim's jaw tightened. "No, can't say I do. We're friends of Eduardo," the man said, as if the name should mean something to Jim. "This block belongs to him. You've been doing business here for a while, but you haven't shown your appreciation," the other 2 men chuckled darkly. It was a shakedown, plain and simple. Jim's grip on the broom handle tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I'm just a barber," he said evenly. "I don't want any trouble." "Trouble's already here," the man sneered, reaching into his jacket to pull out a small pistol. He placed it on the counter, a not-so-subtle threat. Jim's mind raced. He could feel the old instincts kicking in, the ones that told him to act before it was too late. But this wasn't a battlefield. It was his barbershop, a place he had worked hard to build. He didn't want bloodshed here. The leader leaned in closer, his voice a low growl. "You're gonna pay up or things are gonna get messy. Understand?" Jim met the man's gaze, his expression unreadable. He wasn't afraid. He hadn't felt fear in years. But what he felt now was something worse. Anger. Jim stared at the pistol on the counter, his expression as steady as his breathing. The room felt charged, like the eerie stillness before a thunderstorm. The 3 men smirked, mistaking Jim's silence for compliance. They had no idea they were standing in the den of a lion. The leader, still leaning on the counter, tapped the gun casually. "Come on, old man. Don't make this hard. Just hand over what you owe, and we'll be out of your hair." Jim straightened, letting go of the broom. He reached for the register, opening it with a soft ding. "I'm afraid I don't have much cash," he said, his tone neutral. The 2 lackeys exchanged smirks, nudging each other as if they'd won. The leader chuckled. "Good. Now we're getting somewhere." Jim slowly pulled out a handful of small bills and coins, setting them on the counter. "This is all I've got for today," he said, meeting the leader's gaze. The man scowled, shoving the money back toward Jim. "You think this is a joke? Eduardo doesn't take pocket change." Jim didn't flinch. His eyes drifted to the mirror behind the men, taking in their positions and movements. The 2 lackeys were getting cocky, their attention wandering. One was fiddling with his phone while the other leaned against a chair inspecting his nails. The leader was too focused on intimidation to notice Jim's calm composure. "I don't want trouble," Jim said again, his voice low. "But you're pushing your luck." The leader's smirk disappeared. He grabbed Jim by the collar, yanking him forward. "You don't get to talk to me like that, old man. You think you're tough? I could end you right here." Jim's hands gripped the counter, his knuckles whitening. The memories of his SEAL days flooded back. Nights spent on the razor's edge between life and death. Missions where every second counted. He wasn't just a barber. He was a trained killer, forged in the fires of war. The leader's grip tightened. but Jim didn't react. "Last chance," the man hissed. With a speed that defied his age, Jim's hand shot out, grabbing the leader's wrist and twisting it sharply. The gun clattered to the floor as the man cried out in pain. Before the others could react, Jim shoved the leader backward, sending him crashing into a chair. The lackey nearest to Jim lunged, but Jim was ready. He sidestepped the attack, grabbing the man's arm and flipping him over his shoulder. The thug hit the floor hard, gasping for air. The third man scrambled for his own weapon, but Jim was faster. He grabbed the broom he had set aside earlier, snapping the wooden handle in half with a single motion. The sharp end of the stick whistled through the air as Jim swung it, knocking the gun out of the man's hand. The thugs were sprawled across the shop, groaning and disoriented. Jim stood over them, the broken broom handle in his hands, his face calm but unyielding. "Get out," he said coldly. The leader struggled to his feet, clutching his wrist. His eyes were wide with disbelief and anger. "You're gonna regret this," he spat. "You don't know who you're messing with." Jim stepped closer, forcing the man to backpedal. "You don't know who you're messing with," Jim said, his voice quiet but filled with menace. "Tell Eduardo this place is off limits. If I see any of you again, it won't end as kindly." The three men scrambled out of the shop, limping and muttering curses. The black SUV roared away, tires screeching on the pavement. Jim locked the door and took a deep breath. The shop was a mess. Chairs overturned, hair clippings scattered across the floor, but it was still standing, for now. He picked up the pistol from the floor, ejecting the magazine and emptying the chamber with practiced ease. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Eduardo wasn't the kind of man to let an insult go unanswered. Far across town, in a dimly lit mansion surrounded by high walls and armed guards, Eduardo Ortega leaned back in his leather chair, sipping a glass of tequila. The room smelled of cigar smoke and power. Eduardo wasn't just any cartel boss, he was one of the most ruthless men in the business. His reputation wasn't built on negotiations or second chances. It was built on fear. The door to his office burst open, and the three battered men stumbled in. The leader, still cradling his injured wrist, had a look of humiliation etched across his face. "What is this?" Eduardo asked, his voice low and dangerous. He set the glass down on his desk, his sharp eyes scanning the men. "I sent you to handle a simple matter, and you come back looking like you've been through a war." The leader hesitated, then spoke, his voice shaking. "The Barber, he's not what we thought. He fought back. Took us all down like it was nothing." Eduardo's eyebrows rose slightly, his expression a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. "A barber did this?" The lackey who had been thrown over Jim's shoulder stepped forward, nodding quickly. "He's not just a barber, boss. The way he moved, it was like he's trained. Military, maybe." Eduardo's gaze hardened. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "And you thought it would be a good idea to run back here instead of finishing the job?" The leader opened his mouth to respond, but Eduardo raised a hand, silencing him. "You've embarrassed me. You've embarrassed us. This Barber, he thinks he can humiliate my men and get away with it." The room fell silent. Eduardo's men exchanged nervous glances, knowing their boss was already plotting his next move. "Find out everything about this man," Eduardo ordered, his tone icy. "His name, his history, his family, everything, and bring me 10 of my best men. If he wants a war, he'll get one." One of Eduardo's lieutenants stepped forward. "Are you sure, boss? If he's ex-military, he could be dangerous." Eduardo shot him a cold glare. "He's a barber. I don't care if he used to be a Navy SEAL or a Boy Scout. No one crosses me and walks away. Now go." The room emptied quickly as Eduardo's men scrambled to carry out his orders. He leaned back in his chair again, picking up his glass. A uspe, faint smile played on his lips. This Barber had made a grave mistake, and Eduardo was going to make an example out of him. Back at Jim's shop, the barber was cleaning up the aftermath of the confrontation. Broken glass, scattered tools, and overturned furniture littered the floor. He worked methodically, his mind replaying the fight. He knew he'd sent a message, but he also knew it wouldn't end there. Eduardo wasn't the kind of man to back down. Jim's instincts, honed from years of SEAL missions, told him to prepare. He locked the front door and walked to the back room, where a heavy metal trunk sat in the corner. Inside was a collection of tools he thought he'd never need again: knives, tactical gear, and a suppressed pistol. As he strapped on a shoulder holster, A cold determination settled over him. This wasn't the first time he'd faced a cartel, and it wouldn't be the last. But this time, it was personal. This time, they'd brought the fight to him. Deep in the belly of Eduardo's mansion, a group of 10 of his most elite enforcers gathered in a spacious garage, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. The atmosphere buzzed with intensity as weapons were laid out on steel tables: assault rifles, pistols, machetes, and tactical gear. These were not ordinary henchmen. Each man had earned his place by surviving countless brutal missions. They were the best Eduardo had, and tonight their target wasn't just a man. It was an insult to the cartel's reputation. Eduardo himself walked into the room, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete floor. He surveyed his men with a critical eye, ensuring they were ready. "Listen carefully," he began, his voice sharp. "This isn't just about some barber. This is about showing everyone what happens when you cross me. You leave no witnesses. You burn that shop to the ground, and bring me his head as proof." The men nodded in unison, their faces stoic. Eduardo's right-hand man, Carlos, stepped forward. He was a hulking figure with a scar running down his cheek, a man whose reputation for brutality preceded him. "We'll make it quick," Carlos said, his voice low and menacing. "No," Eduardo corrected, his tone chilling. "Not quick. Make it messy. I want him to suffer for what he did to my men." The team began gearing up, checking their weapons and loading ammunition. They moved with precision, a deadly symphony of preparation. Each man wore body armor and carried enough firepower to level a small building. Eduardo watched them with satisfaction. He had no doubt they'd get the job done. As the strike team loaded into 2 black SUVs, Eduardo leaned against the door frame of the garage, lighting a cigar. "Make sure the world remembers who we are," he said, his voice trailing after the vehicles as they roared to life and sped off into the night. Meanwhile, back at Jim's barbershop, the calm of the evening was a stark contrast to the storm heading his way. Jim had transformed the modest shop into a makeshift fortress. The windows were reinforced with plywood, and the door was locked with heavy-duty chains. In the dim light of the back room, Jim stood in front of a small workbench covered with tools of a different kind. Tools of war. He was no stranger to danger, and the SEAL instincts he thought he'd left behind were now fully awake. He'd set up tripwire alarms near the shop's perimeter and positioned a few makeshift traps in case anyone got too close. As he worked, Jim paused and looked around. The shop was more than just a business to him. It was a symbol of his second chance at life, a place where he could leave the violence behind. But now, violence had come to his doorstep, and he had no choice but to face it. Before he continued, Jim checked the time. His gut told him it wouldn't be long before they arrived. He slid a combat knife into his boot and holstered his sidearm. Then he stood silently in the darkened shop, waiting. Make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. The black SUVs glided silently through the deserted streets of the small American town, their headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. Inside the vehicles, Eduardo's strike team sat in tense silence, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of dashboard light. Each man gripped his weapon tightly, their minds focused on the mission ahead. Carlos, seated in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, checked the GPS. They were less than a mile from their target. "Remember," Carlos said, his deep voice breaking the silence, "no mistakes. We move fast, secure the target, and send a message. We don't leave until that Barber is begging for mercy." The men nodded, their eyes hard and determined. The SUVs turned a corner, and the barbershop came into view, a lone building standing in the dim glow of a street lamp. It looked quiet, unassuming, almost ordinary. But Carlos had learned long ago never to trust appearances. As they approached, Carlos raised his hand, signaling the convoy to stop. The vehicles came to a halt a block away, their engines rumbling softly. "We go on foot from here," he ordered. The men spilled out of the SUVs, their boots crunching softly against the gravel. They moved like shadows, their dark clothing blending seamlessly into the night. Carlos led the way, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of movement. The barbershop remained eerily quiet. Inside the shop, Jim stood motionless in the shadows. His breathing was slow and steady, his senses heightened. He heard the faint hum of engines in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots on gravel. They were here. Jim glanced at the clock on the wall, noting the time out of habit. He had spent the last hour mentally rehearsing every possible scenario, every angle of attack. His traps were set, his weapons were ready, and his mind was laser-focused. The team approached the shop. Jim's tripwire alarms triggered. A small but sharp metallic clang echoed in the quiet night, causing Carlos to halt abruptly. He raised his fist, signaling the team to stop. "What was that?" one of the men whispered. His voice tinged with unease. Carlos crouched low, his sharp eyes scanning the perimeter. He spotted a thin wire glinting in the faint moonlight, stretched across the ground just a few feet ahead. "Tripwire," he muttered. "The barber's expecting us." The men exchanged uneasy glances. They were used to being the predators, not the prey, but Carlos smirked, his confidence unshaken. "Good," he said, motioning for the men to spread out. "Let him be ready. It won't save him." Jim, watching through a crack in the plywood covering the window, counted the figures as they spread out around the shop. 10 men, heavily armed and moving with tactical precision. They weren't amateurs, but neither was he, as one of the enforcers approached the front door. Jim triggered the first trap. A small explosive, rigged to the doorframe, detonated with a deafening bang. The blast wasn't strong enough to cause serious harm, but it sent the man flying backward, his weapon clattering. To the ground, chaos erupted. The remaining enforcers scrambled for cover, shouting commands and scanning the building for the source of the attack. Carlos barked orders, his voice cutting through the confusion. "Stay sharp," he yelled. "He's just one man. Surround the building and flush him out." But Jim wasn't waiting to be flushed out. He moved swiftly through the darkened shop, using his knowledge of the layout to his advantage. He positioned himself near the back door, his shotgun in hand, and waited for the next move. The tension in the air was palpable, a fragile thread stretched to its breaking point. Both sides were poised for battle, their every move calculated, their every breath deliberate. The calm before the chaos was over. Carlos signaled 2 of his men to approach the back door of the barber shop. Both enforcers moved cautiously, their rifles trained on the darkened entrance. The door was ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. It felt like a trap, but they had no choice but to proceed. The first man nudged the door open with his foot and stepped inside, his weapon leading the way. The second man followed, scanning the room for any signs of movement. The interior was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a flickering overhead light. Rows of chairs and mirrors lined the walls, their reflections adding an eerie dimension to the already tense atmosphere. Suddenly, there was a loud clang as the second man's foot triggered a pressure plate hidden beneath a rug. Before either of them could react, a steel cable snapped loose from its anchor, slamming into the first man's leg and pulling him to the ground with bone-shattering force. His screams echoed through the shop, and his rifle went skittering across. "The floor! Ambush!" the second man shouted, raising his weapon, but Jim was already on the move. Emerging from behind a cabinet, he struck with ruthless precision. A brutal strike to the man's temple, with the butt of his shotgun, sent him crumpling to the floor. Outside, Carlos heard the commotion and cursed under his breath. "Get in there," he barked, signaling 4 more men to enter through the same door. The team rushed inside, their weapons raised and eyes scanning every shadow. The shop's interior was a maze of mirrors and furniture, each reflection playing tricks on their perception. One of the enforcers spotted movement in the corner of his eye and fired, shattering a mirror into 1,000 glittering shards. But it wasn't Jim. It was his diversion. Using a piece of reflective tape attached to a chair, Jim had created the illusion of movement to misdirect them. As the men closed in on the source of the shot, Jim struck again. From his vantage point above the rafters, he dropped silently behind one of the enforcers and took him down with a swift chokehold. Before the others could react, he vanished back into the shadows. "Stay together!" Carlos shouted, his frustration mounting. "He's using the dark against us." Meanwhile, Jim moved like a ghost through the shop, his Navy SEAL training giving him the edge he needed. Every step was calculated, every move deliberate. He wasn't just defending himself, he was dismantling the cartel's team, one man at a time. One of the enforcers attempted to flank Jim, moving toward the back storage room, but as soon as he stepped through the doorway, he triggered another of Jim's traps. A tripwire activated a weighted shelf which came crashing down onto the man, pinning him to the ground. Hearing the commotion, another enforcer rushed to help his trapped comrade, but Jim was ready. From his hiding spot, he launched a flashbang grenade into the room, temporarily blinding and disorienting the would-be rescuer. In the chaos, Jim seized his opportunity. He emerged from the shadows and incapacitated both men with swift, precise strikes. His movements were fluid and efficient, a testament to years of elite training. Carlos was growing desperate. "He's picking us off," he growled, his mind racing for a solution. He called for the remaining men to regroup outside. "Listen up," Carlos shouted as the team regrouped near the SUVs. "We underestimated this guy. He's not just some random barber. He's trained, military, maybe. But he's still one man, and we've got the numbers. We hit him hard, all at once. No more splitting up." The remaining cartel enforcers nodded grimly, their confidence shaken but not broken. Armed with their remaining firepower, they prepared for an all-out assault on the barbershop. Inside, Jim took a moment to catch his breath. He knew the fight was far from over. The cartel would come at him with everything they had, and he had to be ready. He tightened his grip on his shotgun, his mind focused on the battle ahead. The first strike was over, but the real fight was just beginning. The cartel's SUVs formed a semicircle around the barbershop, headlights illuminating the building and casting sharp shadows across the parking lot. Carlos, now visibly angry but determined, barked orders to his men. "Spread out, but keep the pressure on him. He's good, but no one man can hold out forever," he growled, rallying the shaken enforcers. They moved with renewed determination, their rifles trained on the building. This time, they weren't taking any chances. Grenades were passed around and a plan was set. Flush Jim out and finish him in the open. Inside the shop, Jim's sharp instincts picked up the change in strategy. The cartel wasn't playing it safe anymore. They were coming full force. He crouched behind a reinforced counter, quickly scanning his surroundings for options. His traps had bought him time, but he knew they wouldn't be enough against a full assault. He reached into his stash of supplies, pulling out 2 smoke grenades and a compact drone equipped with a camera. Activating the drone, he sent it buzzing through a small opening in the shop's wall, giving him a bird's-eye view of the attackers. Through the drone's feed, he saw the enforcers advancing cautiously, spreading out to cover every angle. Carlos was standing near the lead SUV, issuing commands into a radio. 2 men approached the front of the shop, their rifles trained on the shattered windows. The first grenade was launched. A loud explosion rocked the front of the barbershop as the grenade tore through the wooden frame, sending debris flying. Smoke and dust filled the air, but Jim remained calm. Using the drone's camera, he tracked the movements of the attackers. "They're trying to flush me out," he muttered to himself. "Let's see how they handle some chaos." Pulling the pin on a smoke grenade, he rolled it toward the back entrance. Thick clouds of smoke began to fill the shop, obscuring the interior and creating a perfect cover for his next move. With the smoke spreading, Jim activated his emergency exit plan. Pressing a button hidden beneath the counter, he triggered a hidden trapdoor in the floor. The door led to a narrow tunnel that exited into an alley behind the shop, a precaution he had built years ago, never expecting to actually use it. Meanwhile, the cartel enforcers were moving in. "Move! Move!" Carlos shouted as his men advanced through the smoke-filled shop. They kicked over furniture and fired into the shadows, expecting to flush Jim out at any moment. One of the enforcers, stepping cautiously near the counter, spotted the trapdoor just as it was closing. "He's escaping!" he yelled, pointing to the floor. Carlos stormed inside, his rage reaching a boiling point. "Follow him," he ordered. "He doesn't get away." 2 men jumped into the trapdoor, descending into the narrow tunnel, but Jim was ready for them. The alley behind the shop was silent, but Jim was already in position. As the first cartel enforcer emerged from the tunnel, Jim took him down with a quick, silent strike, using a combat knife to disable him before he could alert the others. The second man, unaware of his comrade's fate, climbed out moments later and met the same end. Carlos, waiting above ground, grew impatient. "What's taking so long?" he barked into his radio, but no response came. Realizing the trapdoor wasn't yielding results, Carlos ordered his men to regroup outside. They began to spread out, searching the area around the shop. Jim moved like a predator through the dark alleyways, stalking his prey. Using his intimate knowledge of the area, he anticipated where the cartel enforcers would search next. One by one, he picked them off, using guerrilla tactics to sow fear and confusion. One enforcer, walking alone near the dumpsters, heard a faint rustling sound behind him. He turned, his rifle raised, but saw nothing. A moment later, Jim emerged from the shadows and incapacitated him with a swift, precise chokehold. Another enforcer, standing near the SUVs, heard the muffled sound of a struggle, but didn't react quickly enough. Jim used his silenced pistol to take him out before slipping back into the darkness. Carlos was now down to just a handful of men. His confidence had given way to desperation, and his frustration was palpable. He pulled out his own weapon, scanning the shadows for any sign of Jim. "Enough of this. Show yourself, coward," Carlos shouted into the night, but Jim didn't respond. He was already setting up his next move, a final decisive strike that would put an end to the cartel's reign of terror. The parking lot was eerily quiet. The once confident cartel members were now shadows of their former selves, jittery and paranoid. Each of Carlos's men moved with hesitance, their nerves frayed from Jim's relentless attacks. Carlos clenched his teeth, gripping his weapon tightly. The night wasn't going according to plan. He had underestimated the man they were up against, a mistake he swore he wouldn't repeat. "We're not leaving until we finish this," Carlos growled, rallying his men for one last push. Jim, however, wasn't done either. Perched on the rooftop of a nearby building, he surveyed the scene below. With every passing moment, the cartel's formation crumbled further, their fear evident in their movements. Jim knew that this was the time to strike. He quickly set up a small arsenal he had brought with him: flashbangs, tear gas, and his trusty suppressed rifle. His military training had taught him how to neutralize superior numbers by exploiting their weaknesses, and tonight, fear was his most powerful weapon. Jim carefully lined up his first target, an enforcer pacing nervously near the SUVs. A single silenced shot dropped the man before anyone even realized what had happened. Panic set in immediately. "He's picking us off one by one," one of the cartel members shouted, spinning in circles, unsure of where to aim. Carlos, trying to maintain control, barked orders: "Stay in pairs, watch each other's backs," but his voice lacked the authority it had earlier in the night. Jim smirked from his vantage point. He could see the cracks forming in their morale. The men were no longer organized. Now they were just scared individuals clinging to the hope that they could survive the night. And then Jim made his move. He tossed a flashbang into the center of the group, the device exploding with a blinding flash and deafening bang. The cartel enforcers stumbled, disoriented and clutching their ears. Before they could recover, Jim was on them. Sliding down from the rooftop, he landed with precision, taking out two men in quick succession with hand-to-hand combat. His movements were fluid and lethal, each strike calculated to incapacitate without wasting energy. Carlos turned, his eyes widening as he saw Jim emerge from the chaos. For the first time that night, the cartel leader felt fear. "You're in over your head, Carlos," Jim said coldly, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. Carlos raised his weapon, but Jim was faster. With a swift kick, he disarmed the cartel leader and sent his rifle skittering across the pavement. The remaining enforcers froze, unsure of whether to intervene or flee. Jim grabbed Carlos by the collar, pulling him close. "You came into my town. You messed with the wrong man," he growled. "Now you're going to pay for it." But Carlos wasn't ready to give up. In a desperate move, he pulled a concealed knife from his belt and slashed at Jim. The blade grazed Jim's arm, drawing blood, but the ex-Navy SEAL barely flinched. Instead, he countered with a brutal punch that sent Carlos sprawling to the ground. Before Carlos could get up, Jim pinned him down, his knee pressing into the cartel leader's chest. "Your men are finished. You're finished," Jim said, his voice steady and commanding. "And now, you're going to answer for everything you've done." The remaining cartel members, seeing their leader defeated, dropped their weapons and raised their hands. It was over. Jim had single-handedly dismantled the cartel's operation in his town, proving once again that his training and determination were unmatched. As the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, Jim stood tall, his gaze fixed on Carlos. "Looks like your ride's here," he said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. The bright flashing lights of the police cars illuminated the darkened parking lot, signaling the end of the cartel's reign in the area. Jim stood motionless, watching as the officers swarmed in to secure the scene. They had no idea the full scope of what had just transpired. To them, it would look like another routine bust, a gang-related shootout where the victims and perpetrators were all too familiar, but Jim knew better. As the officers approached, Jim stepped away from Carlos, who was now cuffed and glaring up at him, hatred in his eyes. Jim didn't care. The man had made his choice when he decided to terrorize this town. "What the hell happened here?" one of the officers asked, scanning the scene with confusion as he noticed the chaos and the bodies of cartel enforcers littering the ground. Jim, with a calm demeanor, nodded toward Carlos. "This guy and his crew tried to take over. I took care of the rest." The officer's eyes widened slightly, his gaze flicking from Jim to the incapacitated cartel members. You did all this?" he asked, his voice almost skeptical. Jim didn't respond. He didn't need to. His actions spoke for themselves. The officers moved in, cuffing the rest of the cartel members and securing their weapons. It wasn't until they approached Jim, as if suddenly realizing they hadn't even bothered to check him for injuries, that one officer spoke up again. "Are you all right?" Jim glanced at his arm, where the knife had sliced through his sleeve. The wound wasn't deep, but blood stained his shirt. "I'm fine," he said, brushing off the officer's concern. But the officer wasn't convinced. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "You know, we can't just let you walk away from this. You can't be playing vigilante around here." Jim met the officer's gaze evenly. "I did what I had to do. You think this is the first time I've had to step in when the law doesn't get there fast enough?" His tone was calm, but filled with a quiet menace, as if to remind the officer who he was up against. The officer hesitated, clearly conflicted. On one hand, he knew that Jim had saved the town from a serious threat, but on the other, there were rules. Jim was no longer a soldier under the authority of the Navy. He was just a civilian who had gone beyond the law. The standoff was brief. "Listen," the officer said after a long pause, "I'm going to have to take a report from you. But you did our job for us tonight. We owe you." Jim nodded but said nothing more. He wasn't looking for gratitude. His actions were always calculated, never for recognition. He was a man of few words, and in that moment he knew he had sent a message to Carlos and anyone else who thought they could push him around. As the officers rounded up the cartel members, Jim took a step back, his eyes scanning the parking lot one final time. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. While Carlos and his crew would be behind bars, others would rise to take their place. Cartels weren't dismantled in one night. They were a network, a spiderweb of power and corruption that could only be cut at the root with time. But for tonight, Jim had accomplished something that few would have dared to attempt. As Jim walked away from the scene, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. The streets, once filled with tension and fear, now felt oddly peaceful. The town would wake up to find that it had been saved by one man, an ex-Navy SEAL who had refused to let his home be taken over. He didn't need recognition or praise. All he needed was the satisfaction of knowing that the job had been done. The morning light cast a soft glow over the town, but for Jim, the sense of relief was short-lived. He walked down the quiet streets, his mind replaying the events of the previous night. The adrenaline was still there, but now it had been replaced with a quiet unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a dangerous enemy in Carlos and his cartel. Even though they were locked up, it wasn't over. Cartels were like shadows. Just when you thought they were gone, they reappeared, lurking in the corners of the world. Jim knew this better than anyone. He'd seen it firsthand during his time in the Navy. The world was full of enemies, each one more dangerous than the last, and none of them ever gave up easily. They waited, bided their time, and then struck when you least expected it. As he entered his small, modest home, he threw his gear onto the couch and began to take stock of his injuries. A cut here, a bruise there, nothing serious, but he was used to dealing with pain. It was a part of the job, a part of life, but the toll on his mind was different. The quiet after the storm always left room for reflection. Jim sat at his kitchen table, looking at the empty cup of coffee in front of him. He had always thought that once the danger was over, he would feel a sense of peace. But instead, all he could think about was how much the world had changed. There was no place for men like him anymore. Men who did the dirty work so others didn't have to. He had been a soldier once, fighting for a country that seemed to have forgotten about him. Now, he was just a man trying to survive in a world that was increasingly becoming lawless. The phone on the counter buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from his old friend Mark, another veteran from his time in the service. "You good?" Jim stared at the message for a moment before typing his response. "I'm fine. Just need some time to think." Mark didn't reply immediately, but Jim knew he didn't need to say much. They both understood the weight that came with their past, the things they had seen, the things they had done. It wasn't easy to forget, and it wasn't easy to move on. But in a way, it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Jim took another deep breath and glanced at the clock. It was still early, and the town hadn't fully woken up yet. He grabbed his keys and headed for his car, deciding to check on the barbershop. The thought of returning to his old life, even for a few hours, was comforting. It was familiar. It was a place where he could blend in, a place where he didn't have to be the man who fought battles in the shadows. As he drove through the winding streets, he thought about how quickly things had escalated. One minute, he was running a quiet barbershop, and the next, he was fighting off cartel members. The contrast was jarring, but but it was his reality now. His peaceful life had been shattered, but in a way, it had been a long time coming. Arriving at the shop, Jim noticed that the sign was still intact, the front door was locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. The town was still blissfully unaware of the drama that had unfolded the night before. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and turned on the light. Everything seemed normal. The clippers were neatly arranged, the chairs were in place, and the old leather couch by the window was where he had left it. He took a deep breath and settled into his chair, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. For the first time since the incident, he felt the weight of exhaustion creep up on him. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the silence of the room envelop him. But even in the calm, his thoughts remained restless. The bell above the door jingled, and Jim's eyes snapped open. He stood up instinctively, expecting to see a customer. But as he turned toward the door, he froze. It wasn't a customer who had entered the shop. It was a man in a suit. Jim tensed as the man in the suit stepped further into the shop. His mind immediately raced to the possibilities. Was this another cartel member, or someone sent to tie up loose ends? His hand subtly rested on the edge of the counter, where his straight razor and shears were neatly arranged. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but after the chaos of last night, his instincts were sharper than ever. The man stopped just inside the door, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tile floor. He was tall, in his mid-30s, with an air of authority about him. His eyes locked onto Jim, and there was an unsettling familiarity in them that Jim couldn't place. The man didn't look like someone you'd expect to find in a small-town barbershop. His well-fitted suit, sharp tie, and sleek demeanor screamed high profile. "Good morning," the man said, his voice calm, controlled. "I was hoping to have a word with you, Mr. Foster." Jim raised an eyebrow. "I don't know you. How'd you find me?" The man smiled slightly, though there was no warmth in it. "Let's just say I've got people who know how to find anyone. It's my job, after all." Jim's suspicion grew. This wasn't just any stranger. The way he spoke, the way he moved, it was clear that he wasn't a local. He had the kind of demeanor that suggested he was accustomed to control. "Okay," Jim said, folding his arms. "You've got my attention. What's this about?" The man took a step closer, scanning the room as if he were taking in every detail. "I've heard about the altercation you were involved in last night," he said, his voice dropping slightly, as though he was testing Jim's reaction. Jim's heart skipped a beat. He didn't like how this guy was talking. It was like he knew everything about what had happened, down to the last detail. And that wasn't something Jim could afford. He had spent years living quietly under the radar, and he wasn't ready to jump back into the chaos of his past. "I'm not sure what you mean," Jim replied, though his voice betrayed a hint of tension. The man's smile widened, but it wasn't comforting. "You don't have to play coy, Mr. Foster. We both know what happened. You were at the center of an attack last night, a cartel attack, no less." Jim's muscles stiffened, and his mind raced. How the hell did this guy know all of that? His hand instinctively moved toward his back pocket, where he kept a concealed firearm, but he quickly caught himself. He wasn't going to escalate things without knowing more. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jim repeated, his voice firm now. "But if you're looking for a haircut, I'm happy to take your money." The man ignored the offer, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not here for a haircut, Mr. Foster. I'm here because I think you're in over your head, and I think you might be able to help me." Jim eyed him warily, his mind churning with possibilities. He had a gut feeling that this guy wasn't just some random government agent or businessman. There was something else about him. "I don't need your help," Jim said slowly, his voice low but certain. "I can handle my own problems." The man took another step forward, seemingly unfazed by Jim's cold reception. "I'm sure you can, but the problem is that you're not dealing with the average criminal. The cartel you tangled with last night, they don't take kindly to loose ends. They'll come back for you, and they'll come back harder." Jim's heart rate increased, but he didn't let it show. "I'm not scared of them," he said, his voice flat, though the lingering thoughts of last night's chaos crept back into his mind. The man chuckled, though it wasn't a friendly sound. "That's the problem, Jim. You're too confident. You're not seeing the bigger picture. These guys, Carlos and his men, they're a part of something much bigger than you realize." Jim's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to feeling cornered, but this guy had a way of making him question everything. "So what's your angle? What do you want from me?" The man's expression shifted slightly, becoming more serious. "I'm offering you an opportunity. You've got the skills that would be useful to someone like me. I'm with an organization that deals with problems like the one you're facing. We've dealt with cartels before, but we need someone on the inside, someone who knows how they operate." Jim felt a flicker of unease in his gut. He wasn't someone who worked with anyone, He trusted only himself, but this guy was making it sound like he was offering a lifeline, something that could help him get ahead of the danger that was coming his way. "What do you mean, someone on the inside?" Jim asked cautiously. The man leaned in slightly, his voice dropping even lower. "I mean that we need someone who can infiltrate the cartel, someone who can gather intel, someone who can strike when they least expect it. We've got the resources to help you, but we need your expertise." Jim's mind was racing. He could feel the weight of the man's words bearing down on him, but the offer seemed too good to be true. He had been living a quiet life for years, away from the violence, away from the noise of his past life in the Navy SEALs. And now, this stranger was offering him a chance to take down the cartel, a group that had already caused him more trouble than he'd ever expected. Jim shifted his weight, still sizing up the man in the suit. His instincts told him to be wary. This wasn't some simple request. It was a proposition that came with strings attached. If there was one thing Jim knew from his years of service, it was that nothing came for free. And there was no such thing as a good Samaritan in the world he once inhabited. "I don't work for anyone," Jim said, his voice steady, though his mind was still torn. "I haven't done that for years." The man across from him nodded slowly, almost as if he expected that response. "I figured you'd say that," he replied, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a manila folder. He slid it across the counter toward Jim, who eyed it suspiciously before looking back up at the stranger. "You don't have to work for me, Jim," the man said, his voice smooth. "But I can help you. We can help you. You don't have to face this alone. In fact, if you want to take down the cartel, you'll need more than just a blade and a good set of reflexes. You'll need intel, resources, people who are already positioned to get results." Jim stared at the folder, the weight of his decision pulling at him, the temptation to be part of something bigger, to take down the men who had terrorized him. And his town was strong. But was this a trap? He wasn't naive. He knew that once you got involved with organizations like this, you could never walk away clean. "And what's in it for me?" Jim asked, eyeing the folder again. The man smiled. Again, this time a little more genuinely, as though he had been waiting for that question. "Everything. We'll get you the information you need. We'll give you the muscle, the tech, and the people to strike when the time is right. You've been living on the edge for too long, Jim. You know as well as I do that the cartel won't let you go. They'll come after you sooner or later. It's only a matter of time." Jim could feel his pulse quickening. The idea of revenge, the idea of finally ending the threat that had haunted him, was powerful. But even more, there was a piece of Jim's nature that longed for action, the thrill of outsmarting the enemy, the adrenaline rush of making the impossible possible. His time as a Navy SEAL had made him addicted to that kind of danger, but it also had taught him how to avoid unnecessary risks. "So what happens after I help you? Do I get out of this alive?" Jim asked. The man's face grew more serious, though there was a glimmer of confidence in his eyes. "That's the idea, but it's up to you. You can walk away now, Jim. You can go back to your life and pretend none of this ever happened. But if you don't take this opportunity, I can guarantee you one thing. Sooner or later, the cartel will finish what they started. And I don't think you want to find out what that feels like." Jim stayed silent, his eyes locked onto the man's. This was the moment where everything could change. He could either walk away and face the consequences of his inaction, or he could take the offer and throw himself back into the very world he'd fought to leave behind. There was no middle ground. After a long pause, Jim exhaled slowly. His gaze dropped to the folder in front of him. He could hear the buzzing of the lights above him, the clink of scissors on the counter, but it all felt distant. Finally, Jim spoke. "All right, I'll do it. But don't think for a second that I'm in this for you. I'm doing this for me. I want those bastards to pay. And when this is over, I'll be gone. No strings attached." The man smiled again, this time with satisfaction. He nodded and slid the folder closer to Jim. "You've made the right choice. Inside that folder, you'll find everything you need to know. The targets, the locations, the intel, and trust me, this will be the last time you have to deal with the cartel." Jim took the folder, his hand steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He could feel the weight of the decision settling in, but there was no turning back now. This was the moment that would define everything to come. The man turned to leave, but before he stepped out the door, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "One last thing, Jim," he said. "Don't trust anyone, not even me. You're on your own now." Jim couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but he pushed it aside. He needed to focus. This was his chance, his only chance, to make the cartel pay for everything they'd done. They had cost him more than just his peace of mind. They had taken his family's sense of security, his livelihood, and had turned his life upside down. But now he had the means to hit back. The folder felt heavier in his hands than it had moments before. He knew what was inside: names, addresses, contacts, and, most importantly, targets. The intel was detailed, too detailed. Jim had always trusted his instincts, and every fiber of his being was telling him to be careful, that this might be more than he bargained for. But it was too late to turn back now. He stepped into his small, cluttered apartment and tossed the folder onto the table. The room smelled of stale coffee and the faint scent of aftershave, a reminder of his old life. The walls, lined with photographs of his time in the military, seemed to mock him, silently asking why he was back here. Why wasn't he still out there making a difference? The reason was simple. The Navy had been his life, but now that life felt like a distant memory. Jim paced back and forth, his boots scuffing against the hardwood floor. His fingers hovered over the folder, but he didn't open it right away. First, he needed to think. He needed to remember how to plan, how to approach this as a SEAL, not as a man who had spent too many years in hiding. He went to the closet where his old gear was stored. It was a strange comfort to him, almost like stepping back into a past life. A duffel bag, a couple of tactical vests, and, most importantly, his combat knife, a tool he had relied on more than once during operations. He ran his fingers over the cold steel of the blade, feeling the sharp edge that had once served him so well. Before he could even begin to organize his thoughts, there was a knock on the door. Jim's head snapped up, his instincts kicking in. His hand went instinctively to the sidearm he kept in the drawer. He wasn't expecting company. He crept silently toward the door, peering through the peephole. A figure was standing on the other side, their silhouette barely visible in the dim hallway light. "Who is it?" Jim called out, his voice calm, but with a tone that suggested he was prepared for anything. A familiar voice came through, the words muffled but recognizable. "It's me. Let me in." Jim relaxed slightly. It was the man who had given him the folder, the man with the suit. He opened the door cautiously, keeping a hand close to his weapon. "What do you want?" Jim asked, eyeing the man who stood before him. The man stepped inside without waiting for permission, his shoes clicking against the floor. He looked around the room, taking note of the clutter, the half-packed bags, and the old military photos that adorned the walls. It didn't take much for Jim to realize that the man was studying him, sizing him up as much as Jim had sized him up earlier. "I've got new information," the man said, sliding a fresh stack of papers onto the counter. "Some of your targets have moved locations, and there are a few additional players involved. You'll need to adjust your plan accordingly." Jim didn't need to ask questions. He knew the drill. There was always something that went wrong in the field, whether it was intel, timing, or the unpredictability of the enemy. Jim had learned that the hard way. The man's presence here only confirmed one thing: this mission was bigger than he had anticipated. "Where's this new intel coming from?" Jim asked, already flipping through the papers. "And who else is involved in this operation?" The man didn't hesitate, as though he expected the question. "I've got people watching, eyes everywhere. You'll need to trust me on this." "Jim, you've got no time to waste." Jim's instincts flared again. He wasn't used to trusting anyone, especially when the stakes were this high. But he also knew that if he was going to make it through this, he needed to use every resource available. The cartel wasn't a typical adversary. They had eyes everywhere, and their reach was global. Jim knew that he'd be stepping into a hornet's nest, but there was no turning back now. "All right," Jim said, his voice low but steady. "I'm in. But if anyone double-crosses me, it won't end well." The man gave him a sharp nod. "Understood. You'll have everything you need. The first move is yours." With that, the man turned and walked out, leaving Jim alone with the stack of intel. Jim stared down at the papers in front of him, his mind already calculating the best way to approach this. The pressure was building, but he was used to that. It was time to take the fight to the cartel, and nothing, not even the fear of the unknown, was going to stop him. Jim sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the new intel pressing down on him like a physical force. His fingers ran over the papers, skimming through the details that had been handed to him. Some of the names were familiar, others were new players that he'd need to learn more about. His mind raced through possible strategies, weighing every option as he tried to piece together a plan that would put an end to the cartel's reign of terror. He knew he had to be smart about this. The cartel had too many resources, too many people in their pockets, and too many ways to track him down. But Jim was no ordinary man. He wasn't just an ex-soldier, he was a Navy SEAL. He had been trained to think outside the box, to anticipate every possible move of his enemy. If he was going to survive this, he had to stay one step ahead. Jim's apartment was quiet now, save for the ticking of an old clock on the wall. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, and began to plot. The first target was a man named Javier Guzman, a high-ranking member of the cartel who had recently moved into the area. Guzman was known for his ruthlessness and cunning. He was the type of man who would strike first, ask questions later. Jim's mind flashed back to his days as a SEAL. Nothing ever went according to plan in real combat. That's why he had learned to expect the unexpected. He marked Guzman's location on the map. The man had recently acquired a high-end mansion in the outskirts of the city, a property that was fortified and surrounded by a small army of guards. This wouldn't be easy, but it was a necessary first step. Guzman was the one pulling the strings, and if Jim could take him out, the rest of the cartel would crumble. Jim pulled out his old field gear, a tactical vest, a radio, and a set of tools he used for both survival and combat. It was a small but necessary reminder of who he was. His Navy SEAL training had taught him how to survive in hostile environments, how to move unseen, how to neutralize threats before they even saw him coming. But this time, it wasn't just about survival. It was personal. The hardest part, Jim knew, was going to be getting in and out without leaving a trace. The cartel was notorious for making examples out of people who crossed them. If he was caught, it would be over for him and for everyone he cared about. But Jim wasn't afraid. The weight of his past and the desire for justice had pushed him to this point. It was now or never. He packed his gear into a bag, leaving only the essentials behind. He took one last look around the room, then grabbed his car keys and walked out. His mind was already on the mission ahead, but his thoughts kept drifting back to his old life. The Navy had been his family, and the loyalty they shared was something that never truly left him. Now, it wasn't just about revenge for the cartel's actions, it was about taking back control of his life, his future. Jim's car roared to life as he sped down the street. He had to be careful. The cartel was everywhere, and there was no telling who might be watching. He kept a low profile, avoiding the main roads and staying off any radar. His instincts told him to be cautious, and his years of experience had taught him that the best way to fight an enemy was to be unpredictable. As he neared the outskirts of the city, Jim's thoughts turned to the other members of the cartel he would need to deal with. Guzman wasn't the only one pulling the strings. The cartel's network stretched far and wide. And it wasn't just men like Guzman who made things happen. It was the people who operated in the shadows, the ones who controlled the money, the weapons, and the logistics. Jim would need to take out the entire operation if he was going to send a message that they couldn't ignore. But there was no time for hesitation. Jim had already committed to this, and he knew there was no turning back now. The stakes had never been higher, and he was more prepared than ever to make them pay. The sun was setting behind the skyline as Jim approached the mansion, its tall gates looming like a fortress. The exterior of the building was impressive, reflecting the wealth and power that came with being one of the top dogs in the cartel. It was a far cry from the simple, rugged life he'd once known as a Navy SEAL. But it was also a stark reminder of the lengths to which people like Guzman would go to maintain their control. Jim parked his car a few blocks away, blending in with the few other vehicles on the street. He took a deep breath and checked his gear one last time. Everything was in place. His tactical vest, his silent weapons, and the few items he needed for survival. He was ready. As he approached the mansion on foot, he kept to the shadows, moving like a ghost. His footsteps were silent on the pavement, his eyes scanning every corner, every window, and every movement around him. He had done this countless times before. There was nothing new about it, but something about this mission felt different. There was a sense of urgency, a driving force that had nothing to do with the job itself. It was personal. He reached the perimeter of the mansion without incident, his mind working quickly to assess the situation. There were 2 guards posted at the front gate, their heads turning every few seconds as they kept watch. Jim smiled to himself. He knew exactly how to handle this. Using the cover of darkness, he moved silently towards the left side of the mansion, where the fence was lower and less protected. It was a risky move, but it was his best option. He'd have to work fast, making sure not to trigger any alarm. Jim slid through a gap in the fence and crouched low, blending into the shadows. He could see the guards, their attention focused on the entrance, unaware of the danger lurking behind them. He smiled again. This was his element. Jim's years in the Navy had taught him how to become invisible, how to operate in hostile territory without leaving a trace. He moved quickly, each step measured and deliberate. He could hear the faint sounds of his own breathing as he approached the side entrance. The mansion was quiet, the only sounds coming from the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But Jim was far from relaxed. He knew that things could change in an instant. One wrong move and the whole mission would be compromised. As he reached the side door, Jim checked the lock. It was a simple deadbolt, easily bypassed. With a few swift movements, he had it open and was inside the mansion. The air inside was cool, and the scent of expensive wood and leather filled his nostrils. Everything in this house screamed wealth and power, but it also reeked of danger. Jim knew that Guzman's men wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who posed a threat to their operation. He moved through the mansion's halls, his movements fluid and precise. He was getting closer to his target. The layout of the house was familiar. To him, he'd studied it extensively before making his move. Guzman's office was on the second floor, and that's where Jim knew he would find the man he had come to eliminate. As he moved up the stairs, Jim's heart rate began to pick up. He was getting closer. The tension in the air was palpable. He could almost taste it. The moment of reckoning was near. But then, as he rounded the corner, something unexpected happened. Two guards appeared, walking down the hall toward him. Jim's eyes narrowed, and his hand instinctively went to the knife at his belt. This wasn't part of the plan, but he was ready. Without hesitation, he lunged forward, his body moving faster than the guards could react. He knocked one of them to the ground with a swift elbow to the chest, sending him crashing into the wall. The second guard reached for his gun, but Jim was already on him. He disarmed the man with a brutal twist of the wrist, sending the weapon skittering across the floor. The guards, now completely caught off guard, were no match for Jim's training. Within seconds, they were both incapacitated, lying unconscious on the floor. Jim quickly checked their weapons, ensuring that neither had triggered an alarm. He didn't have time to waste. Guzman was still somewhere in the house, and Jim needed to finish the job. He moved past the incapacitated guards, his body poised for the next challenge. The final confrontation was inevitable, and Jim was prepared to do whatever it took to end it. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to back down now. Jim had heard rumors about Guzman, about the man's ruthlessness, his iron grip on the cartel, and the fear he instilled in even the bravest of men. But standing just outside the door of Guzman's office, Jim felt nothing but a cold, burning focus. The mission was simple. Eliminate Guzman, leave no trace, and escape. The rest of the world didn't matter to him. This was personal now, and he wasn't about to back down. The hallway was quiet, save for the faint hum of a distant air conditioning unit. Jim's eyes darted across the walls, scanning for any movement. The house seemed eerily silent. He approached the office door, listening carefully. He could hear muffled voices, the sound of chairs shifting, but nothing that indicated imminent danger. Guzman was likely in a meeting, surrounded by his trusted men. Jim knew this was his opportunity. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. With a quick motion, Jim kicked the door open. His foot slammed into the wood with a force that made the door fly inward. The office was spacious, dark wood furniture arranged meticulously, giving the room an air of controlled power. Guzman sat behind a massive desk, his face twisted in a scowl as he looked up at the intruder. "Who the hell are you?" Guzman spat, his voice low but filled with venom. His hand moved toward the desk, where a sleek pistol lay, just out of reach. Jim didn't answer. Instead, he charged across the room, closing the distance between them in an instant. Guzman's bodyguards, two men who had been seated nearby, stood up in a panic, but they were no match for Jim's speed and precision. He grabbed the first guard by the collar, throwing him into the second, sending both crashing to the ground in a tangled heap. Guzman lunged for his pistol, but Jim was faster. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it with a brutal motion. Guzman yelped in pain, his fingers losing their grip on the weapon. Jim threw the gun across the room where it skidded into a corner. Guzman, now completely vulnerable, tried to scramble back from his desk, his eyes wide with fear. "Who are you?" Guzman demanded again, this time his voice trembling. Jim finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that you're finished." With that, Jim stepped forward and drove his knee into Guzman's chest, knocking the wind out of the man. Guzman gasped for air, his face turning red as he struggled to breathe. He tried to swing a punch at Jim, but the former Navy SEAL was already one step ahead. Jim grabbed the man's arm, twisting it painfully behind his back before slamming him onto the floor. Guzman let out a strangled cry, but Jim wasn't interested in hearing his pleas. He reached into his vest and pulled out a small silent knife, a weapon meant for quick, clean kills. Guzman's eyes widened in fear as Jim loomed over him, the blade glinting in the dim light. "Any last words?" Jim asked coldly. Guzman, desperate and gasping for breath, nodded weakly. You don't know what you're doing," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "They'll come for you. You think this is over?" Jim paused for a moment, his fingers tightening around the hilt of the knife. Guzman's words were empty threats. Jim had heard them all before. He knew exactly what Guzman was trying to do, buy time. But Jim was beyond that now. His mission was clear. Without another word, Jim moved swiftly, his knife flashing through the air. Guzman barely had time to register the motion before the blade sank deep into his chest, ending the man's life in an instant. The room fell silent, save for the soft sound of Guzman's body hitting the floor. Jim stood over the fallen cartel leader, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done it. The job was complete. Guzman was dead. But even as he stood there, victorious, Jim knew that this wasn't the end. The cartel wouldn't just let this slide. There would be repercussions. Jim had killed their leader, and they would be coming for him next. The air around him seemed to thicken with tension. Jim knew that it was time to leave, fast. He turned and moved toward the door, but as his hand reached for the handle, something caught his eye. A hidden safe embedded in the wall behind Guzman's desk. It was small, but it was exactly what Jim had been hoping to find. This wasn't just about revenge. There was a bigger picture at play, and the contents of that safe might be the key to stopping the cartel once and for all. Jim took a moment to compose himself. He was in a room filled with death and destruction, yet his focus remained razor sharp. Guzman was gone, but there was still work to be done. His eyes darted to the wall where he'd spotted the hidden safe. The feeling in his gut told him that whatever was inside could be the key to dismantling the cartel's entire operation. The money, the drugs, the power, they all rested on what was inside that safe. Jim's fingers moved quickly, scanning the area for any indication of how to open it. He circled the desk, keeping a wary eye on the door, listening for any signs of approaching danger. The last thing he wanted was to get caught in a compromising position. He couldn't afford to be distracted. After a quick inspection of the safe's surroundings, Jim spotted a small button hidden beneath a dark panel in the wood. It was almost imperceptible, but his trained eyes immediately noticed the faint wear around it. With a flick of his finger, he pressed the button. The safe's door slid open with a soft mechanical hum. Inside was a neatly organized collection of documents and several bundles of cash, millions of dollars worth. But what caught Jim's attention was the folder in the back, tucked neatly behind the piles of money. It wasn't labeled. It was something more valuable than any drug shipment or illegal transaction. It was the information Jim needed to finally put an end to the cartel's reign of terror. Jim grabbed the folder and quickly thumbed through its contents. It was full of contracts, names, and codes, detailed records of cartel activities. What was even more telling were the documents listing high-profile politicians and law enforcement officials tied to the cartel. This wasn't just about drugs anymore. This was about corruption at the highest levels of society. He scanned a particular document that caught his attention. It was a list of payoffs, each one linked to powerful individuals with some names he recognized. The implications were staggering. This was the kind of information that could take down not just the cartel, but an entire network of criminal operations tied to the government. Jim's pulse quickened as he realized the gravity of the situation. He had to get this information into the right hands, but that meant escaping. And with the cartel's men now likely aware of Guzman's death, Jim knew he didn't have much time. He grabbed the folder, quickly slipping it into his tactical vest, and moved to the door. Every instinct told him to leave immediately, but something else held him back. He knew that once he walked out of that room, there would be no turning back. His thoughts raced. Could he really escape with such vital intel? Could he expose the entire network without being caught by the cartel's forces? But it was too late for second guesses. There was no option but to move forward. Jim checked the hallway one more time. It was still quiet, but he could sense the shift in the atmosphere. His ears caught the faintest sounds of approaching footsteps, soft but unmistakable. Time was running out. He didn't hesitate. Moving swiftly and quietly, Jim slipped out of the office and into the hallway. He wasn't sure where he would go, but he knew one thing: he couldn't stay here. Not now. Not with the cartel closing in on him. Jim could feel the weight of the folder pressing against his chest. It was heavy with knowledge, dangerous knowledge. The cartel's reach was farther than he'd anticipated, and if this information got into the wrong hands, it would be catastrophic. He had to leave, but leaving wasn't going to be easy. Guzman's men were everywhere, and the clock was ticking. His first instinct was to make his way to the back exit, but as he rounded the corner, he saw two armed guards patrolling the area. They had no idea what had just happened, but it wouldn't be long before they discovered Guzman's body. Once they realized Jim was no longer in the office, the chase would begin in earnest. Jim took a deep breath, his Navy SEAL training kicking in. He wasn't about to be cornered again. He needed plan fast. He looked around the hallway, scanning for an escape route. There were two doors ahead. One led to a stairwell and the other to a service corridor. Both offered potential ways out, but the stairwell was too open, too obvious. He needed to be stealthy. The service corridor was his best option. As he crept toward the door, Jim's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind remained focused. His eyes narrowed as he tried to anticipate what might be waiting for him on the other side. The corridor wasn't much better than the hallway, narrow, dimly lit, and claustrophobic. But at least it was out of sight. It might give him a better chance to find a more secure exit. He pushed open the door quietly, his senses heightened. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, he heard footsteps echoing from the far end of the corridor. Jim didn't hesitate. He moved swiftly, hugging the walls and staying low. The last thing he wanted was to be spotted now. As he rounded a corner, Jim found an unlocked maintenance closet. He quickly ducked inside, taking a moment to steady his breathing. He couldn't afford to make a single mistake. The minutes dragged on like hours as he waited for the guards to pass. His eyes flickered toward the door as he heard footsteps getting closer. His grip tightened on the folder. He had to get out, but he couldn't afford to rush. Patience would win this fight. Eventually, the sound of the footsteps faded, and Jim exhaled slowly. The corridor was silent once again, but that didn't mean he was in the clear. The guards were out there, and they were getting closer to discovering Guzman's body. Once they did, all hell would break loose. Jim couldn't afford to wait any longer. He opened the door and slipped out into the hall once more. His heart raced, but he moved with purpose, determined to make it to the back exit. His plan was simple: get to his car, drive out of there, and then figure out his next move. He wasn't going to stop until he had exposed the cartel's network for good. The back exit was in sight. Jim's pace quickened as he approached the door, but just as he reached for the handle, he heard a voice behind him. Not so fast. Jim froze. His body went rigid as he turned around slowly, eyes wide with surprise. Standing in the doorway was one of Guzman's men, armed, ready, and prepared to fight. "You're not getting away that easily, gringo," the man sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger of his rifle. Jim's mind raced. He had no time to waste. The fight wasn't over yet. Time seemed to slow as Jim sized up the man in front of him. He had been trained for moments like this. His mind was calculating, his instincts sharp. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a battle of wills, a test of nerves. The man standing before him was younger than Jim expected, but his eyes burned with that dangerous edge. He wasn't just some low-level goon. This man had been trained, maybe not like Jim, but he knew how to handle a weapon. "You're not walking out of here," the guard snarled, his gun aimed directly at Jim. Jim's hand hovered near the small knife at his side. It wasn't much, but it could be enough in the right moment. He kept his posture relaxed, his movements slow, deliberately non-threatening. He needed to keep the element of surprise on his side. "I didn't come here to fight you," Jim said, his voice calm but cold. "I just want to get out." The guard's lips curled into a cruel smile. Everyone says that just before they die. Jim's mind raced as he thought of the ways to disarm the man. He could dive for the rifle, try to close the distance fast enough, but that would put him in a direct line of fire. No, he needed to get creative. In a split second, Jim made his move. He lunged toward the guard, grabbing the rifle by the barrel. twisting it just as the guard pulled the trigger. The shot missed, but the struggle wasn't over. The two men grappled, rolling across the floor in a brutal fight for control. Jim's military training kicked in. He knew how to disable an opponent, how to use leverage to his advantage. In a matter of seconds, he had the guard in a chokehold, the rifle slipping from the man's grasp as he tried to break free. Jim tightened his grip, forcing the guard to go limp. The moment the threat was neutralized, Jim stood up, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He hadn't wanted to kill the man, but he knew he had no choice. It was survival. He grabbed the rifle and checked the ammunition. It was just enough to get him to his car. Jim slung the weapon over his shoulder and headed toward the exit again, knowing that his chances of getting out alive were growing slimmer by the second. The cartel wouldn't take kindly to the loss of one of their own. It wouldn't be long before more men came looking for him. His escape was now a race against time. As he approached the door, Jim could hear the distant sound of approaching footsteps. More cartel members. They were closing in fast. There was no way he could outrun them. His only hope now was to make it to his car, but the path was clear only for a few more yards. Jim pushed the door open, sprinting through the alleyway behind the building. He didn't look back, trusting his instincts to guide him. Every muscle in his body was on high alert. He could feel the sweat pouring down his back, his heart thundering in his chest. The alleyway was empty, but Jim knew that wouldn't last for long. He could hear the distant rumble of engines, maybe 2 or 3 cars, heading in his direction. He had to make it to the street before they did. He rounded the corner, and there it was. His car, parked just a few feet away. But before he could reach it, the unmistakable sound of tires screeching filled the air. A black SUV came barreling around the corner, and Jim's stomach dropped. There were at least 3 men inside, all armed, ready for a fight. They had him cornered. Jim didn't hesitate. He dove behind a dumpster, pulling the rifle from his back. His breath came in sharp gasps as he steadied his aim. The first man stepped out of the SUV, looking around. Jim took the shot. One clean hit to the chest. The man dropped to the ground, and the other 2 scrambled for cover. The remaining men returned fire, their bullets ricocheting off the alley walls. Jim ducked low, moving as quickly as he could while keeping his head down. He couldn't waste time aiming for a perfect shot. He needed to stop them fast. He sprinted toward the SUV, knowing it was now or never. As he got closer, one of the men popped his head out from behind a car and fired. Jim's instincts kicked in, and he dropped to the ground, narrowly avoiding the shot. He fired back, hitting the man square in the shoulder. With one last push, Jim reached the SUV, diving into the front seat and slamming the door behind him. He gunned the engine, the tires screeching as he floored the gas pedal. The SUV that had been pursuing him was now just a blur in his rearview mirror. He had escaped, but Jim knew this wasn't over. The cartel wasn't going to stop. They would come after him, and they would send everything they had to take him down. But Jim had a secret weapon, something the cartel wasn't prepared for. He knew their weaknesses, and he wasn't going to stop until every last one of them paid for what they had done. Jim didn't slow down. His heart was racing, adrenaline coursing through his veins, but his mind remained sharp, calculating. He knew the cartel wouldn't stop coming, but now he had a taste of what they were capable of, and he was ready to give it back. The streets blurred past him as he sped away from the hideout, his hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled determination. His mind kept replaying the events that had led him here. It hadn't been the simple day he had expected, but Jim wasn't about to be a victim. No one ever got away with targeting him. No one. As he neared a small diner on the outskirts of town, Jim made a quick decision. It was time to plan his next move, and there was no better place to blend in than a quiet, unassuming diner. He pulled into the parking lot, eyes scanning for any signs of danger. It was just a temporary stop to regroup. He needed to keep moving, but he couldn't do it without taking a breath. The moment he stepped out of the car, a voice from behind him made him freeze. "Nice try, soldier." Jim spun around, his instincts instantly on alert. There, standing across the street, was a figure he recognized, another cartel enforcer. This one wasn't alone. 3 more men stood with him, guns raised, ready for a fight. But Jim had seen this before. The cartel made one critical mistake. They underestimated him. With one smooth motion, Jim reached for his pistol, his movements as practiced and fluid as ever. He fired, hitting the closest man in the chest, and in the same instant, he ducked, taking cover behind a nearby car. He had to keep moving. He couldn't waste time trying to take them all out. The plan was simple: escape and plan his next "Move." The other three men opened fire, their bullets tearing into the car. Jim didn't waste time. He sprinted, zigzagging across the lot, making it toward the diner's back door. As he reached the door, he quickly slipped inside, slamming it behind him. Inside, the diner was nearly empty. The few people who had been there had already scrambled out, leaving only the elderly waitress behind the counter. She gave him a confused look, but Jim didn't have time to explain. "Stay down," Jim told her firmly, his voice low but commanding. He moved quickly, pushing past the kitchen doors, searching for an escape route. His eyes scanned the room, and his mind worked at lightning speed. He needed to get to the back alley where his truck was parked. The door to the kitchen suddenly crashed open. Jim spun around, his pistol aimed at the man who had entered. It was the same cartel enforcer who had spoken to him earlier, now just a few feet away. The gun in his hand was raised. "You really think you can just escape, huh?" the enforcer sneered. Jim didn't answer. He wasn't going to waste words on a man who was already dead. He fired twice, hitting the enforcer in the chest. The man fell to the floor with a heavy thud. There was no time to linger. Jim pushed open the back door and dashed into the alley, his heart pounding as his feet hit the pavement. He could hear the sound of the other men following close behind. Jim's truck was just ahead, but the alley was narrow and the path was cluttered with trash and debris. It was going to be a tough escape. He could already hear the distant hum of an engine. The cartel wasn't far behind, but this was Jim's territory now. He sprinted toward the truck, leaping into the driver's seat without looking back. His hands flew over the steering wheel as he started the engine and slammed the gas pedal. Tires screeched as the truck barreled down the alley, the sound of pursuit growing fainter behind him. Jim didn't slow down. He wasn't sure how much longer he could outrun them, but one thing was clear. The cartel wasn't going to take him down. He wasn't some low-level target. He was Jim, a former Navy SEAL, and he wasn't afraid of anyone. As he reached the edge of town, Jim made one last crucial decision. The cartel had underestimated him. They thought they could just roll in, threaten him, and get away with it. But Jim was a man who didn't forget, and now he was going to make sure the cartel never came after anyone like him again. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jim had one goal: survival, and he was going to make sure the cartel would never forget the mistake they made in messing with him.